The polished crystal award felt heavier than I expected, its sharp edges digging into my palms. The stage lights were blinding, a sun-like glare that bleached the faces in the front rows into a sea of indistinguishable white blurs. 1,000 people were on their feet, their applause a deafening roar that vibrated through the floorboards and up into my chest. I had practiced my speech 100 times in the mirror, but standing here, I couldn't remember a single word. My heart wasn't pounding with nervousness, though. It was calm, cold even. My eyes scanned the vast auditorium, past the expensive tables and cheering executives, all the way to the back, to the cheap seats in the highest balcony. And there she was, Clara, my sister. Even from this distance, I could see the look on her face, magnified on the giant screen next to the stage. It wasn't just anger or jealousy. It was pure, unadulterated shock. The kind of shock you see when someone's entire reality crumbles in an instant. Her perfectly made-up face was pale, her mouth slightly agape. She was watching me, the brother she had mocked, belittled, and discarded, accepting the Innovator of the Year award. She was the one who said I would be nothing without her. Now she watches me on TV accepting an award for my success. Her words from that last, terrible argument echoed in my mind, clearer than the applause. "You're a dreamer, a charity case," she had sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. "You will never amount to anything. You need me. You need this family. Without us, you will crawl back here in a year, begging for scraps." It hadn't been a year. It had been 5. And I wasn't crawling. I was standing on a stage she could only ever dream of, holding a symbol of a success she couldn't comprehend. The camera zoomed in on my face, and I made sure to look right into the lens, right at her. You might be asking why I would even want her here to see this. Why not just disappear and enjoy my victory in peace? Because this award isn't just for my work. It's the final chapter of a story she started, and she needed to be here to see how it ends. Our story begins, as most of these stories do, in a house that looked perfectly normal from the outside. A tidy lawn, a 2-car garage, a painted front door. But inside, it was a kingdom with 2 subjects and only 1 ruler. My sister Clara was the princess. I was the serf. From my earliest memories, our roles were clearly defined. Her needs were paramount, mine were an inconvenience. Her feelings were delicate, needing constant protection, mine were irrelevant. I remember our 10th and 8th birthdays, which fell in the same month. For Clara's 10th, my parents rented a bouncy castle and hired a magician. The backyard was filled with 24 of her friends, laughing and screaming as they devoured a 3-tiered cake. She received a brand new bicycle, a stack of video games, and clothes that probably cost more than our monthly grocery bill. 2 weeks later, for my 8th birthday, my mother placed a single, slightly lopsided cupcake in front of me after dinner. She lit the candle, sang a tired, off-key version of Happy Birthday, and then immediately started clearing the dishes. My gift was a pair of socks. Not new socks, but a pair from a multi-pack my dad had bought for himself. They were too big. This pattern repeated itself in everything. When Clara got a B+ on a report card, she was praised for her effort and taken out for ice cream. When I brought home a perfect score on a statewide math exam, my father glanced at it and said, "That's nice. Now go take out the trash." My accomplishments were met with indifference, while hers were celebrated as monumental achievements. My purpose, I learned very quickly, was not to succeed for myself. It was to make her life easier. I was the one who had to do her chores when she had too much homework. I was the one who had to stay home from a friend's house because Clara didn't feel well and needed someone to fetch her things. The clearest example was the antique lamp. It was my grandmother's, my mother's most prized possession. One afternoon, Clara knocked it over while chasing the cat. I was in the next room. Hearing the crash, my mother stormed in, saw the shattered porcelain, and her eyes immediately landed on me. Clara, with tears already welling in her eyes, simply pointed a trembling finger in my direction. I wasn't asked what happened. I was simply found guilty. No alibi, no defense. I was grounded for a month, my meager allowance taken away to help pay for the damage. Clara, the actual culprit, got a hug and was told it wasn't her fault she was so energetic. That night, I saw her smirking at me from her doorway. It wasn't a childish smirk. It was a look of calculated victory. She knew she had absolute power, and I had none. As we grew older, the roles they assigned us became shackles. High school was less about education and more about preparing Clara for her grand destiny. She decided she wanted to be a lawyer, and my parents treated her ambition like a royal decree. They hired expensive tutors for her SATs, paid for debate club trips across the state, and bought her a new laptop for her research. My path was never discussed. When a guidance counselor asked me what I wanted to be, I said an engineer. I loved taking things apart, understanding how they worked, and building them back better. The counselor was impressed with my grades in math and science. When I mentioned this at home, my father just grunted and said, "There's good money in plumbing. You're good with your hands." The message was clear. Clara was meant for a corner office. I was meant for a tool belt. The breaking point came the summer after I graduated. I had secretly been working my tail off, not just in my classes, but on applications for scholarships. My grades were excellent, and I managed to secure a full-ride scholarship to the State University's engineering program. It wasn't a fancy Ivy League school, but it was my ticket out. It was everything. I waited for the right moment to tell them, naively believing that a full scholarship, a free education, was something they couldn't possibly argue with. That moment came when my parents called a family meeting. They sat me down at the kitchen table, a somber look on their faces. Clara was there, looking unusually demure. "Son," my father began, his voice heavy with false gravity, "we need to talk about college. As you know, Clara has been accepted to a prestigious pre-law program. It's a fantastic opportunity for her, for this family." My mother chimed in, "But it's very expensive. We've looked at the numbers, and we can only afford to send one of you to school right now." I saw where this was going, but I had my ace in the hole. "That's okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I got a full scholarship. It pays for everything." I slid the acceptance letter across the table. For a second, there was silence. I expected relief, maybe even a flicker of pride. Instead, my mother picked up the letter, her eyes scanning it with a strange, calculating look. "Oh, honey, that's wonderful," she said. But her tone was flat. "But this changes things. Clara's university is one of the best in the country. This state school? It's fine, but it's not the same level. Her career will lift this whole family up." Clara looked at me, her eyes glistening with crocodile tears. "My dream depends on this," she whispered. Then my father delivered the final blow. "This is perfect. You can decline the scholarship, stay here, get a full-time job at the factory, and send money to help Clara with her rent and books. We all have to make sacrifices. It's your turn to help your sister." They weren't just asking me to give up my dream. They were asking me to personally fund hers. For a long moment, I just stared at the three of them, sitting there at the kitchen table. My father, with his look of stern, self-righteous authority. My mother, with her practiced, worried frown that was meant to signify motherly concern, but was really just a mask for her ambition for Clara. and Clara herself, the perfect picture of fragile hope, her entire future supposedly resting on my shoulders. In that silence, something inside me didn't just break, it vaporized. It was the last thin thread of familial duty, of childhood love. It was gone. In its place, a cold, quiet clarity settled in. These were not my family. They were my captors. And I would no longer be their prisoner. I looked up from the table, smoothed my face into a mask of resigned defeat, and nodded slowly. "Okay," I said, my voice hollow. "If that's what it takes for Clara to succeed, I'll do it." The relief on their faces was immediate and sickening. My father clapped my shoulder, a gesture of false camaraderie. "That's my boy. Knew we could count on you." My mother started chattering excitedly about packing lists for Clara's dorm room. And Clara gave me a small, pitying smile. The smile of a queen for a peasant who knows his place. That smile was the fuel I would need for the next 5 years. The next day, I told them I was starting at the local warehouse, just as my father suggested. They were pleased. It was a dead-end job, physically demanding with no future. It suited their narrative for me perfectly. But I never set foot in that warehouse. Instead, I took a job in the mailroom of a small but growing software company called Innovatech. It paid less, but it put me inside the walls of the world I wanted to join. And that scholarship? I didn't decline it. I called the university, explained a family emergency, and had it deferred for a year. I enrolled in online classes at a community college, paying for them with the meager salary from my mailroom job. My life became a carefully constructed lie. By day, I was the dutiful son, handing over a significant portion of my paycheck to my parents, who then wired it to Clara for her living expenses, which, I later learned, included weekend trips and designer handbags. They'd ask how work was, and I'd mumble something about sore muscles and long hours. They would nod, satisfied. At night, when they were asleep, my real life began. Hunched over a cheap second-hand laptop in my cramped room, I wasn't a mailroom clerk. I was a student. I devoured textbooks on programming, network architecture, and data science. I learned to code. I slept 4 hours a night, fueled by cheap coffee and a burning, singular focus. While Clara was at parties, I was debugging lines of code. While she was complaining about a tough professor, I was building my first simple application. They thought I was standing still, but I was running a silent marathon. For 2 years, my life was a relentless grind. Mailroom by day, coding by night. I handed over half my paycheck to my parents every 2 weeks, and they never questioned it. In their minds, I was their simple, dutiful son, working his body to the bone at the warehouse. The thought that I might be doing anything else never entered their heads. They had written my story for me, and they were content with it. But inside the walls of Innovatech, a different story was taking shape. I wasn't just delivering mail. I was listening. I learned the names of the programmers, the projects they were working on, the problems they were trying to solve. I absorbed the language of the place like a sponge. The opportunity came on a Tuesday afternoon. The company's internal network went down. Not just slow, but completely dead. Panic set in. The small IT department was overwhelmed, and every minute of downtime was costing the company thousands of dollars. From my mail cart, I could hear the frantic conversation. They were talking about a recursive loop in a login script that was flooding the server with requests. It was a problem I had literally just studied in one of my online courses the week before. On a scrap of paper, I scribbled down 3 lines of code, a kill command for the specific process, and a suggestion for a patch. My hands were shaking. I walked over to the director of engineering, a man named Mr. Harrison, and held out the piece of paper. "Excuse me, sir," I mumbled. "I overheard. Maybe try this." He stared at me, the mail kid, with pure annoyance. But he was desperate. He snatched the paper, glanced at it, and then his eyes widened. He barked the commands to one of his engineers. 30 seconds later, the system came back online. The office erupted in relieved cheers. Mr. Harrison forgot about me until the end of the day. He called me into his office. He didn't ask about the mail. He asked me about my code. For an hour, he grilled me. The next morning, I wasn't the mailroom clerk anymore. I was a junior associate programmer with a salary triple what I had been making. At home, I told my parents I'd been promoted to forklift operator at the warehouse and got a small raise. They were pleased. I continued to give them the same amount of money, but now it was less than a quarter of my take-home pay. The rest went into my secret bank account, which was beginning to look substantial. Meanwhile, the calls from Clara became more frequent and more desperate. Law school was harder than she thought. She needed money for tutors, for bar association fees, for a new suit for an internship interview. My parents' savings were dwindling. The pressure on me increased. Clara is so close to the finish line, my mother would say, her voice strained. We just need to help her a little more. Another $100 a month from you would make all the difference. I paid it. Every dollar I sent was another brick in the wall I was building around myself. They thought they were bleeding me dry, but they were just watering the seeds of my escape. The house of cards came crashing down a week before Clara's final exams in her 3rd year. The call came late on a Sunday night. It was Clara, hysterical. She was crying so hard my mother could barely understand her. The gist of it was that she had been caught plagiarizing a major paper. She wasn't just going to fail the class. She was facing academic expulsion. The dream was over. The future my parents had invested everything in, my future, my money, my sacrifice, was turning to smoke. The panic in the house was suffocating. My father paced the floor like a caged animal. My mother was sobbing, her face a mess of tears and disbelief. The next morning, they cornered me before I left for work. They looked haggard, their eyes red-rimmed. "We need to talk," my father said, his voice grim. They sat me down at that same damned kitchen table. "Clara made a mistake," my mother began, her voice trembling. "A stupid, foolish mistake. But her life isn't over. There's a lawyer we can hire, an academic council we can appeal to. But it's going to cost money. A lot of money." My father leaned forward, his eyes boring into me. "You've been working at that warehouse for 5 years now. You don't have a girlfriend. You don't go out. You must have saved something. We need it. All of it." They wanted $20,000. They assumed that was the most a warehouse worker could possibly have saved. It was a fraction of what was sitting in my account, but they didn't know that. They just saw me as their last resort, their emergency fund. I looked from my father's desperate, demanding face to my mother's tear-streaked, pleading one. The cold clarity I'd felt 5 years ago returned, now as hard as diamond. I had been waiting for this moment. I took a slow breath. "No," I said. The word hung in the air, small and yet powerful enough to shatter the world they lived in. My father's face turned purple with rage. "What did you just say?" my mother gasped. "David, she's your sister!" "No," I repeated, my voice steady and calm. "There's no money for Clara. The Bank of David is closed." "You ungrateful brat!" my father roared, slamming his fist on the table. "After everything we've done for you." "What have you done for me?" I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. "Given me hand-me-down socks for my birthday? Blamed me for things I didn't do? Demanded I give up my future to pay for hers?" I stood up. By the way, I don't work at the warehouse. I quit that job 5 years ago." The confusion on their faces was almost comical. Just then, Clara herself, who had driven home in disgrace the night before, emerged from her room. Her face was puffy, her eyes filled with venom. "What is he saying?" she demanded. When my mother explained I had refused, Clara turned on me. "You have to. You owe me. You're nothing without us. You're a pathetic, blue-collar loser. You'll fail and come crawling back, begging us to take you in." I just looked at her, at the raw, unfiltered entitlement. I didn't say another word. I walked to my room, picked up the single bag I had packed weeks ago, and walked to the front door. Their yelling followed me, a storm of insults and threats. I didn't look back. I just pulled the door closed behind me, the satisfying click of the latch sealing them in their collapsing world, and me out in the free, open air. My first apartment was small, with peeling paint and a view of a brick wall. It was the most beautiful place I had ever seen. The silence was the first thing I noticed. There was no one yelling, no one making demands, no one filling the air with disappointment. For the first time since I was a child, I could breathe. That night, I didn't unpack. I ordered a cheap pizza, sat on the floor, and for the first time in 5 years, I slept for 8 uninterrupted hours. I woke up feeling not just rested, but reborn. The chains were gone. With the constant emotional and financial drain of my family severed, I poured all of my energy into my work at Innovatech. I was no longer just a programmer. I was a problem solver. I worked relentlessly, not because anyone was forcing me to, but because I was finally building something for myself. I got promoted from junior associate to lead programmer of my own team within 18 months. My project, codenamed Aegis, was a new type of encryption protocol, one I believed could revolutionize data security. It became my obsession. It was the engineering problem I had dreamed of solving since I was a kid, tinkering with broken radios. For 3 years, there was complete silence. I didn't call them, and they, stubborn and proud, never reached out to me. They were waiting for me to fail. They were waiting for me to come crawling back, just as Clara had screamed I would. Every day that I didn't call was another victory, another confirmation that I didn't need them. Their power over me had always been based on the lie that I was worthless without them. My silence was the proof that the opposite was true. I heard about the house by accident. An old high school acquaintance messaged me on social media, asking if I'd heard that my old neighborhood was changing. "Saw your parents sold their place," he wrote. "Hope they're doing okay." A few discreet inquiries through a distant cousin painted the rest of the picture. With Clara's legal career in ashes and no extra income from me, they couldn't afford the mortgage. They had downsized to a small rental apartment in a rougher part of town. Clara, my brilliant sister destined for greatness, had never recovered from her academic disgrace. She was working as a receptionist at a dental office. The grand family project had ended in total failure. I felt no pleasure in hearing this news, no glee, just a cold, detached sense of order being restored. It was like watching a mathematical equation solve itself. They had built their lives on a foundation of injustice, propping up a weak pillar while trying to demolish a strong one. I had simply walked away, and the whole rotten structure had collapsed under its own weight. I put the phone down and went back to work on Aegis. My revenge wasn't going to be about their failure. It was going to be about my success, and it was almost complete. Aegis launched a year ago. The results were better than I could have ever imagined. My encryption protocol wasn't just good, it was revolutionary. It was almost immediately acquired by a consortium of major tech giants in a deal that made Innovatech's founders wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. And me, As the lead architect and patent holder, very comfortable. The industry journals started writing articles about me. I was the mailroom prodigy, the self-taught genius. They didn't know the half of it. They didn't know the late nights, the cheap coffee, or the cold fury that had fueled every line of code. Then came the letter, a thick, cream-colored envelope with the seal of the National Technology Guild. I had been nominated for the Innovator of the Year award, the most prestigious honor in my field. When I read the news, I didn't feel elation. I felt a quiet clicking sensation, like the final tumbler falling into place in a complex lock. This was it. This was the platform. This was the public stage I needed to end the story once and for all. Some people might have chosen to enjoy their success in private, to simply disappear, and let their tormentors wonder what became of them. But that wasn't enough for me. Their crime wasn't just what they did. It was the narrative they created, the lie that I was nothing. A lie they probably still told themselves in their cramped apartment, a comforting fiction to explain away their own failures. I wouldn't let the lie stand. They needed to see the truth with their own eyes. It wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation. It was about judgment. It was about forcing them to witness the reality they had tried so hard to prevent. I didn't call. I had a courier deliver a packet to their address, and inside were 3 tickets to the awards ceremony. The tickets were for section 412, row Z, the highest, most distant seats in the entire auditorium. The nosebleeds. I wanted them there, but I wanted them to understand their new place in my life. Distant, insignificant spectators. I enclosed a simple typed note. I thought you might want to see this. I imagined their confusion, the arrogance that likely followed. They would think I was showing off, that I'd had a little bit of luck and was now desperate for their approval. They would think they were coming to witness an apology. They would have no idea they were coming to witness their own verdict. On the night of the awards, as I stood in front of the mirror adjusting my tuxedo, I felt no nerves. The man looking back at me was not the scared boy from the kitchen table. He was not the exhausted student hunched over a laptop. He was a man who had forged himself in the fire of their neglect. I was ready. I wasn't just going to accept an award. I was going to correct the record, and I wanted them to have a clear view from the cheap seats as I did it. And so, we returned to the stage. The applause eventually died down, and a heavy, expectant silence fell over the auditorium. It was time for my speech. I stepped up to the microphone, the weight of the award a solid, grounding presence in my hand. I looked out, past the lights, and my gaze found the giant screen where I could see my own face, and intermittently, the camera would cut to faces in the crowd. I prayed it would find them. "Thank you," I began, my voice clear and steady. "Thank you to the Guild, to my colleagues at Innovatik, especially Mr. Harrison for taking a chance on the mailroom kid, and to my team, the true architects of Aegis. Your brilliance and dedication made this possible." The crowd applauded politely. I let the sound fade. "People often ask what drives innovation," I continued, my eyes finding the lens of the main camera. "Sometimes it's passion, sometimes it's curiosity. For me, the motivation was a bit more specific. It came from a promise made to me many years ago by people who knew me better than anyone. They promised me that I was a dreamer. They promised that I would never amount to anything. They sat me down at a kitchen table and told me that my only purpose was to sacrifice my future for someone else's. A murmur went through the audience. On the screen, I saw the camera pan across the upper deck, and for one perfect, glorious moment, it zoomed in on section 412, row Z, on my family. My father's face was stone. My mother's hand was covering her mouth, and Clara, Her face was a canvas of dawning horror. They were realizing this speech wasn't for the audience. It was for them. "The most important thing they ever told me," I said, my voice ringing with cold precision, the words that have echoed in my head every single night for the last 5 years, were these: "You will be nothing without us." Tonight, I am here to say, thank you. Thank you for that curse which I chose to accept as a challenge. Thank you for the doubt, which taught me to trust myself. Thank you for the neglect, which taught me to be self-reliant. You told me I would be nothing without you. You were right. I didn't become nothing. I became this. Not without you, but because of what you did. This award is the proof. I held up the crystal trophy. So I dedicate this award to every person who has been underestimated, written off, or told to stay in their place. Your success is the only reply you ever need to give. The auditorium erupted. The applause was thunderous, a genuine emotional roar. On the screen, I saw them. My father, standing up abruptly and pushing his way out. My mother, weeping. And Clara, frozen in her seat, utterly defeated. Later, as I was surrounded by well-wishers, I saw them trying to get through security to the reception area. Clara was yelling my name, her voice shrill and desperate. A security guard was holding them back. I met her eyes across the velvet rope one last time. There was no anger left in me, no hatred. There was nothing. I gave her a slow, final nod, a nod of dismissal, and then I turned my back on them for good and walked into the warmth and light of my own life. The story they wrote for me was finally over. The one I wrote for myself was just beginning.